That was terrific, Nate. You have been well trained at the University of Missouri, and you're doing better now at the Clinton School, and all is well. I am delighted to be back in Little Rock. I haven't been in Little Rock that often, physically, but you may be interested to know that in an earlier time in my life, I used to come spiritually to Little Rock 3 or 4 times a day. That was before I went to the University of Missouri. I went to a little junior college in South Texas, a place called Victoria. Show of hands, how many of y'all know where Victoria is? Oh, terrific. Halfway between Houston and Corpus Christi on the Texas Gulf Coast. When I was going to the junior college, it was in the 1950s, I worked as a ticket agent in the Continental Trailways bus depot. And one of my duties was to call the bus on a PA system, like this. May I have your attention, please? This is your last call for Continental Trailways, 8:10 p.m. Silverside's air-conditioned through liner to Houston, now leaving from lane 1 next to the building. For Inez, Edna, Ganado, Louise, El Campo, Pierce, Wharton, Hungerford, Kendleton, Beasley, Rosenberg, Richmond, Sugar Land, Stafford, Missouri City, and Houston. Connecting in Houston for Huntsville, Buffalo, Corsicana, Dallas, Sulphur Springs, Mount Vernon, Texarkana, Hope, Hot Springs, Little Rock, Memphis, Nashville, Knoxville, Bristol, Charlottesville, Washington, Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, and Boston. All aboard! Don't forget your baggage, please. Now that's terribly relevant to what's going on here tonight, is because that was the first time I was ever paid money to speak into a microphone. So, look, I am delighted also tonight, especially to be in the presence of 3/4 of the 4 people who are very special to Kate and me, and they include, of course, the 2 giant senior gods of Arkansas and American politics, former governors, senators, Dale Bumpers, and David Pryor. Additional thrill, of course, for Kate and me is to have Barbara and Betty here, both of whom are much smarter than either of the giant gods' husbands, as we all know, though every one of you all know have been around Arkansas. Dale and David have been colleagues and friends for many, many years, and I sure don't have to tell you that they have very different personalities. David is quiet, modest, self-effacing, and Dale is not. 2 quick stories, about one each, about them. In 1984, commencement, Vassar College up in New York, the Bumpers had a daughter and the Lehrers had a daughter who were graduating in the same class. The school asked me to give the commencement address, which really angered my friend Dale Bumpers. But the Bumpers went to the commencement, and as soon as the thing was over, Dale was sitting right over there on the left, and I went over to him, shook his hand, and he said, face very straight, he said, I'd have given a lot better one than you did. Story on David. In 1991, David had a heart attack in Washington. Barbara was often in Asia on a Senate wives trip. David Jr., D, called me and said, Daddy's at the hospital, George Washington University Hospital. He knew I'd had experience with heart stuff. And D said, could you go? I said, I'll be there in a minute. Well, I went over there, got to the hospital, and with Dee's and others' help, went right to where David was. He was lying in the intensive care unit, looking really terrible. And I went over and I took his hand, and I said, he couldn't talk. His eyes were closed. And I said, David, relax. It's going to be okay. No movement, nothing. And I said, look, There's no way in hell this hospital is going to let a United States senator die here. And he squeezed my hand and grinned, and I knew everything was going to be all right. And it was. And it has been ever since. Now, Dale is not here tonight, so as I say, when I said there are 3/4 of those folks are here, that's what I meant, and I hope that those of you who run into Dale and you are here tonight, you do everything you possibly can to harass him and belittle him for his failure to show up tonight. I don't know what his reason was. I also want to say a special hello to Bob Sells. Where are you, Bob? There you are, right there. Yeah. Bob and I went to the University of Missouri together. And by the way, Nate, when I was there, they called it Missouri, not Missouri. And I'll leave it at that. Now, about the election. Y'all do remember that. Can you believe it? It was just a week ago today. I bet you don't even remember. Well, I'll remind you what happened. President Obama was reelected. The Democrats maintained control of the Senate, and the House remained led by a Republican majority. It's hard to believe that that's still a very important happening a week ago in this, that election was, because we have been, the last few days, you would think the most important thing that was going on were stories about the intimate life, loves, and emails of various four-star generals. But I just want to remind all of us, and I include myself, that what happened on November 6th is one of the glorious things that happens in our glorious country. It's when the people of this country make a decision about who's going to run things at various levels. And no matter what the results are, just the fact of the election, the peaceful transition of all kinds of things, the peaceful ongoing of things, whatever. And the fact in this particular election, I'm sure you all were as struck by it as I was, the millions of people who waited hour after hour in line to cast a ballot in some places where there wasn't even really that much at stake. The fact of voting meant so much to them. And it's a kind of reaffirmation of everything that our country is and what it stands for. And it's always well just to remember that as we talk about the results. Here we had a 2012 presidential campaign that I think it is not an exaggeration to say was a bit messy, a bit long, a bit expensive. 2 years, if you consider 2 years, $6 billion, a little expensive and a little long. But it happened, and it is the ultimate exercise for the citizens of our country, for us in our democratic society. And so no matter what any of us think of the results, let's always keep that in mind. Now, on the results, I'm sure you all are interested. You probably already have your own views of what the meaning of those results on November 6th were. Fortunately, for me, I'm not a pundit, so I don't have to even touch that subject tonight. I'm talking here about the demographic changes and the ground game, this and the that and all of that. I don't even have to talk about that because I'm a pundit. I'm not a pundit, and only pundits talk about that. But there is one subject, as you all are aware, and as Nate, of course, pointed out in the introduction, and that has to do with presidential debates. And I am very much at ease to tell you that as a result of 2012, the entire electoral process, that nobody will ever be able to, with any credibility or with any kind of straight face, say debates do not matter. Because without a doubt, 2012 has proved that. And it does go back to the Republican primaries. You know, the whole point of those, there were 26 of them. And the whole point of that exercise, of course, is to weed the field. Well, my God, they weeded the field. One day there's this fellow Perry from Texas. And one day they have a debate, then the next day or so he's gone. Michelle Bachmann, she's at the top. Wow, she's doing great. Then after a couple of debates, she's gone. Herman Cain. Now, it wasn't all about debates. He had another problem, too. But as a result of the debates, he scored. He came out of nowhere. Remember, when Herman Cain announced his candidacy, he was less than a blip. And then, as a result of the debates, he was a front runner for 3 or 4 hours. You remember Rick Perry spoke at a big dinner in Washington last year. Kate and I were there, and he was speaking for the Republicans, and he got off a great line. He said, "Well, I'll tell you what, when I look back on this year, I'm going to always remember when I was the front runner for the Republican nomination. I'm always going to relish those 3 hours." Well, that's about what happened with him. Gingrich, he whoop, whoop, boom, gone. Santorum, eventually gone, etc. And of course, when it was all said and done, Mitt Romney was the last man standing, the last candidate standing. And as a result of his performances on over 26 debates, that's why he won the nomination. So please, anybody who says debate, now, the debates themselves, I'm not going to defend those debates. I mean, they were the good, the bad, and the ugly, and to coin a phrase. And there's some of the things that were, some of them turned into pep rallies more than they were debates. I mean, some of the rules they had were outrageous, in my opinion, and should never be used again. The idea, for instance, you've got 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 candidates, whatever it was, and you decide who's going to be in the middle and who gets the first questions based on where the polls are, and you ignore the rest of the candidates, of course, which walks against the whole purpose of the debate, which is to weed the field. If you don't see the field, how in the world are you going to weed the field? And also the idea of letting the audience participate. You know, the yay, they became pep rallies and that sort of thing. And there was only one of those 26 debates where they maintained order, and that was a debate that NBC ran, and Brian Williams was the moderator, was in Florida. But at any rate, like them or not, and there's good reason to not like some of them, the fact is they did their purpose. And then, of course, we go to the general election. And the first debate on October the 3rd in Denver, history was made by that debate. It was the first time since there have been presidential debates. Remember, they began in 1960 with Kennedy and Nixon, and there was 4, and then there weren't any more until 1976, because the incumbent presidents, like Richard Nixon, Lyndon Johnson, they figured all they had to do was lose something if they debated, and they had the power to say, I'm not going to do it. And the only reason that the debates began again, there were nationally televised presidential debates in 1976, is because Gerald Ford, the incumbent, was 17 points behind in the polls because he had pardoned Nixon, and Jimmy Carter was 17 points ahead. Obviously, if he was blah, blah, blah. Anyhow, Jimmy Carter was ahead, and Ford decided the only way he could possibly catch Jimmy Carter was to challenge Carter. In other words, an incumbent president challenge a challenger to a debate. And that's what happened, and so the debates began, and that's why, that's why we still have them now. Probably, who knows what might have happened if Gerald Ford hadn't done that, but that is the fact of it. But ever since then, some of these debates have been very, very important. There have been, and I'll talk about some of those in a moment, where people could argue that it turned the election. There are some of them, and everybody has their own opinion about how important a particular thing that happened in a debate was. The bottom line here is that I believe, and I think most people would agree with me here, that yes, sometimes they're not election changing, but they're always part of a process now that is critical. And the reason they're so critical, the reason they are so important, is it's the only time during any presidential campaign where the candidates, sometimes usually there are only 2. I moderated some in '92, and when there were 3, of course, Ross Perot and Bill Clinton and George H.W. Bush, but usually there are only 2. But they're the only times when the candidates are there on one stage at the same time talking about the same things. It is the rest of the campaign is one-on-one or TV commercials or speeches or something like that, that you read what you read. The only time you get to see the candidates perform one-on-one or two-on whatever in a comparative basis in those debates. And even then, they come late in the campaign, like this year in 2012, they were all the month of October, and the polls showed, remember the polls showed, oh, everybody, 99% or 92% or whatever of the people had already made up their minds. So what the hell's the point about how could the debates be important? Well, they're always important, and I'll talk about 2012 in a minute, but they're always important because even when nothing big happens, as did happen in 2012, but even when something big does not happen, it is an affirming step. It is, people look out and they say, okay, I'm for Billy Bob, but here's Sammy Sue, the opponent, and I get to see him. I'm not going to vote for him, and I hope he doesn't win, but he may. One of these people is going to end up being President of the United States. You take the measure of the individual in those debates. It's not so much about issues, because if you follow the campaign, you already know what they believe about lock boxes for Social Security or Afghanistan troop withdrawal, that sort of thing. You already know basically where they come down. But you look at them and say, hey, can I imagine that person sitting behind a desk in the Oval Office, making a decision about sending Americans into harm's way, reacting to another Katrina, reacting to another 9/11. And you take them, do I like this person, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Body language issues, feeling, just a feel about a person issues, more so than, at that point, more so than do I agree or disagree with the positions that candidate has taken. And that's been true since 1960, and it began again in 76, and all those debates since have been important for that reason, if for no other. Now, there have been some incidents, I call them in the book major moments, and some of them are very trivial. And for instance, my favorite trivial happening in a presidential debate was in 1992, three-way, Clinton, Ross Perot, and George H.W. Bush. It was fortunately, I was not moderating this one. It was a town hall meeting in Richmond, Virginia. You may remember this. Three candidates were on stools, and Carol Simpson of ABC was moderating, and they had a wide shot, and you could see the three candidates, and George H.W. Bush kept looking at his watch. Well, the world came down on his head, and you're going to beat up on him for it. And one of the great things great experiences that I had, in addition to my own experiences with these debates, was I was able first it began as an oral history project, and then it went on to become a documentary thing, and then for my book, I had the privilege of talking to over a period of 20 years, just about every person who was a nominee for president or vice president of the United States and participated in the presidential debate. I was able to talk to them about their debate experiences and about debates in general. Well, I talked to George H.W. Bush, and in fact, I talked to him about 7 or 8 years after he left the White House. It was at his library. There's a Clinton library. Well, there's a George H.W. Bush library in College Station. And in fact, the title of my book, Tension City, came from one thing he said. I asked him some hard-hitting question like, well, what were those debates like, Mr. President? And he said, oh, Jim, those high-visibility things, those are Tension City. Well, that's where the title came from. But anyhow, I also asked him a hard-hitting question, what was that watch thing all about, Mr. President? He said, we were sitting, you know, it was for a television interview, a taped television interview to be cut for a documentary. So he's sitting in a chair, I'm sitting, we're facing each other with a camera, you know, behind each one of us. And this wasn't being broadcast live, it was being taped. At any rate, I said, you know, what was the watch thing about? And he leans across at me and he said, yeah, I looked at my watch in a presidential debate. Anybody who looks at his watch in a presidential debate clearly is not qualified to be president of the United States. I went, my God, he'd come loaded for me. So after he took some few breaths, I said, well, Mr. President, some people said the reason you looked at your watch is because you were kind of, you know, maybe ready, anxious for the thing to be over and a little bit bored. And he said, you're damn right. I looked at my watch and I said, well, I was thinking, how much longer before this crap is over? And he leans and he says, Jim, you can put that in your documentary. And I said, because the cameras were running. See? So I said, Mr. President, we just did. And anyhow, I talked to one of the, of course, the people I talked to about his debate experiences was Bill Clinton. He loved talking about the debate. I mean, it was like shop talk for him. In fact, if he had his way, he'd probably still be talking about presidential debate. I don't have to tell you all that. But anyhow, we talked about the watch. And Clinton said this, that he said, look, if he had looked at his watch, or if Perot had looked at his watch, nobody had paid any attention at all. The only reason it mattered is because there had already been some stuff in the wind about George H.W. Bush being disconnected from the people. Remember, he couldn't make a scanner at a supermarket work, something like that. And so this, what was seemingly small thing, became a confirming thing. And Clinton pointed out the same thing applied in debates in 2000. I moderated all these. These were between George W. Bush and Al Gore. In the first debate in Boston, Gore started grimacing and, going, sighing, all that sort of stuff, while Bush was answering a question. And there was a split screen, and people saw him do it, and people didn't like it. And just like in 1960 with Kennedy-Nixon, people who listened to that debate on the radio thought Nixon won that debate hands-on, no question about it. And those who saw it on television thought Kennedy had won. Same thing happened in the first 2000 debate between Bush and Gore. And an interesting side story to that is Kate and I were there at that debate with our family, with our daughters who were around at least, and when the debate was over, I was walking away from the stage, and one of my daughters, Amanda, was walking by me, and she said, boy, Dad, that was really something that Gore did, wasn't it? And I stopped and said, darling, what are you talking about? What did Gore do? She said, well, all that sign and stuff. I mean, that's what the story's going to be about this debate in the morning. I did not know what in the world she was talking about. Because under the way I do those things, I never ever look at the candidate who's listening. I always look only at the candidate who's talking, because I don't want to engage the other person in some way, affect his reaction. So I was the closest one to him, and I missed the story of the debate. But there have been other debates with what seemingly were small things. One a little more than small was the question to Michael Dukakis from Bernie Shaw of CNN. Also in a debate with George H.W. Bush. You remember the question about Governor, if Kitty Dukakis were raped and murdered, would you be in favor of the death penalty for the perpetrator? And Dukakis took that because he answered it in a very cold, unemotional way and said, I've always been against capital punishment. I said it was kind of a think tanky answer. And it really hurt Dukakis. And here again, Clinton made the point, too, that only hurt Dukakis because he was already known as a cold fish. And all this did was confirm that even more so. And I asked in my interview with Dukakis, I said, what happened? Another one of my hard-hitting questions. And he said, well, he said, to tell you the truth, I've been in public life, I've been governor, I've been in all these things, and I've always been adamantly opposed to capital punishment. To me, it was just, the emotional thing, because everybody said, why didn't you just say, God, I'd grab that guy in my hands and kill him myself if I could. If he'd just done that, and Dukakis said that. Yeah, that's probably politically, thinking back on, that's what I should have done. But I saw it as just another question about my position on capital punishment. But that was not the way the voters saw it. When the thing was over with David Broder, the famous now deceased Washington or political correspondent for the Washington Post, said that election is over, just as a result of Dukakis's unemotional answer, because here again it fed a lot of things that were already in the wind. Now to go up to 2008. 2008. there was a first debate that year between Barack Obama and John McCain, and I moderated that. It was in Mississippi. And we had gotten to a point, I wasn't, when I say we, I don't include me there, we as a general situation had gotten to a point of independence for the Commission on Presidential Debates through the years. The Commission on Presidential Debates as a sideline, is a side issue here, is a bipartisan, semi-nonpartisan group of longtime political people who sponsor and administer the presidential debates. And they began, when they first started doing it, they had to negotiate everything with the candidates' representatives. It became very, very, very difficult. But slowly through the years, through the debate, each election cycle, they got to be more independent. In fact, in 1988, and after that, the first few times I was asked to moderate, the only reason I was asked to moderate so many times is they'd have these big discussions. I wasn't a party to them, and I was only told about them afterward, where they'd have the representatives of each candidate with commission representatives, and they'd talk for hours and argue about who the moderator should be. And finally, they picked me so many times just because they couldn't agree on anybody else. It wasn't because I was a really neat and nifty moderator. But at any rate, the commission has always wanted to push the envelope toward a more real debate format, where you actually have candidates look at each other and talk back and forth and exchange views, etc., rather than just to have it a kind of tried and true Q&A, first question, 2-minute answer, 1-minute response, then a 30-second rebuttal, and etc. And so slowly but surely they've moved toward that. And in 2008, for the first time, the rules permitted the candidates to speak and directly to each other and to question each other. And the commission said to me, which was understandable, we'd really love to see what you can do about this. And in other words, the way they do this, the way they ask you to moderate a presidential debate, by the way, is a little bit like the 7th grade prom question. Penelope, if I were to ask you to the prom, would you go? Well, that's how they do that. They say, look, if we ask you to moderate this particular debate with these rules, will you do it? Well, in this case, they said in 2008, with that new set of rules, and I said, sure, be delighted to give that a whirl. Well, some of you may remember, I tried very hard at the first of the debate. Obama was fine. I mean, he would respond, he would look right at McCain, and I kept asking McCain. McCain would say something, and he would look at me, or look at the camera. He'd never, ever look at Obama. And so I'd say, well, McCain would answer the question, and I would say, well, Senator, would you say that to Senator Obama? Finally, McCain looked at me and said, what's the problem here? You don't think you can hear me? People can hear me? So I decided to hell with this. So and McCain never, ever addressed Obama directly during that entire 90 minutes. And it hurt him. The polls showed afterward, because here again, the Clinton theory, it confirmed something that was already in the wind about McCain. He was a little, nervous, a little bit agitated as a personality, and a little bit difficult. And Obama was a huge deal for Obama, because Obama came over. He was the unknown, remember? Everybody was seeing him full flower for the first time in a major way, and he was the guy who was cool and presidential and all of that. And the polls going in, of course, there was a little thing called the financial crisis that was coming at the same time. But anyhow, the polls showed that they were dead even, just about dead even, some of the polls when that debate began. And when it was over, Obama was ahead on this kind of thing. Well, people didn't like McCain as much as they thought, or people who were leaning that way. At any rate, and Obama stayed ahead from that point on. So these things do matter. And that brings us to the first debate in 2012, and that was the next step. And the next step, which was the decision that the debate commission wanted to try to move it even further. So their proposal was for divided the 90 minutes into 6 15-minute segments. and with 2-minute answers for the first question, and then open discussion for the rest of the 15 minutes, with the emphasis on encouraging direct exchanges. And when I wrote this book, Tension City, one of my decisions when I wrote Tension City was I was never going to do any more debates. I felt free to write the book because I'd done the debates. I had my wife and children had decided this was a good thing too for me not to do any more debates, because these things are they're psychically challenging, to put it mildly. And I don't know if psychically, well, anyhow, they're hell. And it's the agony of not wanting to make a mistake that could affect the outcome of a debate, much less an election. It's there, and and everybody involved. You talk about everybody involved in a presidential debate, from people who are handing out tickets to the candidate, everybody in between, are at a highest possible level of tension, because they are aware of the fact that so much, they're aware of how much is riding on these things. And at any rate, so I had decided I wasn't going to do any more. And then the debate commission came to me and said, look, we've got this, we think we can put this 15-minute thing together. Would you reverse yourself and agree to moderate first debate if we can get that done? And I said, no. End of it. And so then they called me back a few weeks later, and they said, well, we're back because we're close. We think we have it. It would be really helpful if would you consider moderating, so we could tell whoever, I don't know who in the hell they were talking to. I guess there were other people, you know, in the commission or whatever. Would you consider moderating? I said, no. And then they came back and said, look, we've got it. Will you moderate the first debate? And I talked to Kate and our 3 daughters, and they said, don't do it. So I said, okay. Then I called the debate commission and said, okay, I'll do it. Overcome by ego drives and all kinds of other things, I guess. I don't know. I'm not going to try to paint it as some kind of, you know, holier than thou, and aren't I wonderful that I decided to do it. I was intrigued and challenged, and I thought, why not? And so I overrode the family and decided to do it. And so if it hadn't been for that format, I would never have said yes. That's the point I'm trying to make. So those of you who were watching the debate and you wondered what was going on, that's what was going on. And if there was a mistake made, the mistake was it probably should have been explained better going in. The candidates sure knew what was going on. So if any of the candidates and their handlers were complaining, they don't listen to them. But the fact of the matter is, when the debate started, as I told the students here earlier today, I said I had a plan, and a plan for that debate. The plan was to get them talking to each other. Whatever else, get them to exchange directly if I possibly could. My plan was, I had it all worked out, 15 minutes, I was going to do this, and then I was going to go here, it was a plan. And at the beginning, I'm sure you all remember this. If you don't, I sure do. I asked the first question. First question went to President Obama, and first answer went to President Obama, second answer went to Romney, to Governor Romney, and then the deal was I could do anything from then on I wanted to. So I went right back to Obama and asked him to respond directly to Governor Romney about something that Romney had just said. And as you may recall, the president just looked at me and did not look at Romney and talked about something else. And I thought, oh, this is going to be a long 90 minutes. So we went a couple of other exchanges and I was pushing hard to try to keep into the 15 minutes and follow what my plan, and then suddenly I realized, my God, they were talking to each other directly. In other words, the plan was working. So I backed off. and as a result, a lot of subjects that I wanted to cover in my plan I never got to, because in journalism you cut from the bottom, and you can't save the best for last. The best has to go first or forget it. And so a lot of things, that was my only frustration when it was over with, was that I could not cover, because the whole thing was domestic policy, remember, and there are a lot of things besides. I've got the economy and health care and a lot of other things, but I didn't get to some others that I wanted to get to, and that was a frustration. But when it's all said and done, those candidates, President Obama and Governor Romney, talked to each other in a direct way, in a way that two presidential candidates have never done before. My hope is that this will be seen as a positive thing and will not scare the daylights out of future candidates. And the people who are going to run for president will realize that that's part of the drill now. You've got to be prepared to do that. You've got to get up there and not just think in 2-minute sound bites, not in 2-minute prepared answers and whatever. And so I'm hoping, in fact, if you remember the fourth debate, I mean, including the vice presidential debate, there were 4. There's another angle to this too, by the way, was the fourth debate, that was foreign policy, and Bob Schieffer moderated that, and he followed the same thing. In other words, he let him talk. He let it go back. In other words, that was to me was an affirmation, and I think hopefully that it will go on. Very interesting thing, though, that here again I talked to the students about, that the difference originally, when I first signed on to do that debate, the format was going to be, they were going to be seated at a round table like that, and no podiums. And after I'd already accepted and all of that, they came back to me and said, well, there's been a change. Somebody wants podiums, and we've agreed to it, meaning somebody at the debate commission has agreed to it. And so I was free then to back off. I could have done that, and I decided by then my ego was already committed to it, and so I went ahead and did it. But it's a huge difference. It seems huge in a subtle way, because if you're sitting at a table, if I'm sitting there and candidate A is over there, candidate B is there, and candidate B starts talking to, and I can move and hush candidate B. I know how to do that. I've done this for a living for 40 years. I can shut people up with my eyes and whatever. Body language speaks. You cannot do that with podiums. So it increases the amount of time it takes to move from one thing to the other. And a seated thing, you can just turn to the other person and just kind of, you don't have to say, well, what do you think about that? In other words, you can, and it does make a difference. And I'm here again, I'm not defensive about the first debate, quite the contrary, but if it had been seated, it would have been different. I really do believe, and it probably would have been more effective, but it didn't happen. But my guess is, because there is that difference, and because of the experience of the first and the fourth debates put together, I predict that, I don't predict, I think that we have now passed the Rubicon into open discussion in presidential debates. I hope that's the case. Now, I am going to take your questions and comments, and Skip is going to moderate that. Let me give you the guidelines for your questions and comments. I've already said, and let me just underline, I am not a pundit, okay? That's guideline number 1. Guideline number 2 is, I do not handle criticism well, okay?
First of all, thank you very much. That was an excellent answer. And secondly, I heard him at lunch today with about 40 Clinton School students bombarding him with all sorts of questions.
Good questions, great questions.
And let me assure you, he's fine, so throw whatever you want to at him. He's pretty good at it. All right, raise your hands, and we have time. There's a question right back here. Yes, sir. Wait for the microphone, please.
Okay. Hello? Can you hear me? Okay. How would you feel about a debate where each vice presidential candidate gets to debate the presidential candidate in each party? We'd have to have 2 of these.
I'm sorry, where the vice presidential candidate debates the presidential candidate?
That's right. Like if Paul Ryan had debated Barack Obama and Joe
Never
Biden
happened.
had debated Romney. I just wonder
Well,
what that would be like.
Well, it would be an interesting sideshow, but it would not be a meaningful thing because vice presidents are terrific and they're very important people. But that's not what the choice is about. So it would be an apple and an orange. It would be like, say, Bumpers debating Pryor.
I told y'all.
Or the other way around.
Told you he was good. Other questions? Yes, sir. Wait for the microphone. It'll come right behind you.
I can repeat the question, sir.
Surely, with all the funds spent with handlers, why does not anyone realize that they're always on the screen?
Do you hear the question? Question is, when do I plan to go to Little Rock the second time? Now, the question is, why do the handlers not tell these candidates that they're on camera all the time? I don't get it. I don't understand it. You know, we tell people to come on the news hour. First thing I tell people when they come in, I say, okay, now look, once you've been introduced, you assume from then on you're always on camera. So if you don't want people to see it, don't do it. And it's a mystery to me why people at that level, it's happening, but it continues to happen. For instance, after Gore did that in 2000, in 2004, in the first debate, which I moderated with John Kerry, he was in Miami, or Coral Gables, George W. Bush did the same thing that Gore did. And afterward, when I talked to him, I mean, in other words, he kind of, you know, Kerry was talking and he kind of went like this, you know, all that sort of stuff. Not as dramatically as Gore had done 4 years earlier. And so I asked him the question I asked George W. Bush, same question you just asked, in a different, I'm only more directly. I said, he was still president at the time. He was about to leave his presidency. And I said, Mr. President, what happened there? He said, I don't know, just dumb. He said, I mean, here again, he said, I knew what had happened, you know, with Al Gore in my own debate. And here I was doing the same thing. And of course, a lot of it, you know, and here again, I don't want you to interpret what I'm saying as punditry, but through the years, it's been pretty well documented by people who've been alive and looking at these things, anybody, that incumbent presidents do not handle first debates very well because they don't like to be challenged. They're not used to it. They've had 4 years of worship, 4 years of people saying, yes, sir, whatever you want, sir. They haven't heard people saying, hey, you got to prepare for this debate. You've got to get ready. You got to be this and that. That's what happened with Obama. That's what happened to George W. Bush. That's what happened, and there are many, George H.W. Bush. Same thing. You know, he kind of dismissed, yeah, okay, it's going to be all right and all that sort of stuff. Meanwhile, the challenger is just like, I mean, Mitt Romney came on like gangbusters because he came to play. He was ready for that debate. Just like John Kerry came on like gangbusters in 2004 because he came to play. And the incumbent president thought, oh, well, it's going to be all right. I'm the president, for God's sake. And they either don't have handlers who tell them that. My guess is they have handlers who tell them exactly what you just said, but the president said, never, oh, come on, give me a break. And he was, I'm the president. I don't have to do what you say anyhow. So that's my guess. It's more than a guess.
Actually, we have a question. We don't have a microphone over here, so just scream it out and we'll...
I'll repeat you. Oh.
Thanks. Thanks for your time tonight. It's been really interesting. NPR had a few great stories about the way that various types of people reacted to the debates this year. And my reaction to the entire debate that you moderated was, couldn't we just give you the switch to their microphones? Is that, I mean, there were a few times where I thought, if he could just cut them off and switch the conversation himself. Is there any discussion of things like that to help you out?
So you don't believe there should be moderators at all? No, Bob Schieffer had said that. You know, Schieffer CBS, who's moderated one of these and done others, he believes that just kind of the ideal debate would be just for the two candidates to sit down and talk. And that could be ideal, but it's never going to happen. There has to be somebody there to maintain some kind of order. Interesting thing, even that first debate, I let it go. But when it was all said and done, the time was almost equal. And I was very careful. I had a little thing in front. I knew exactly what was happening in terms of timing between the amount of time each candidate had and all. Somebody's got to do that. Otherwise, the person who talks the longest would be grossly unfair. Somebody has to, all halls need to be monitored. And that includes halls that lead to the presidency through debates. But with a light hand, I agree with you there.
We got a question right back in the very back. Bob, Alex got a question.
Thank you, Mr. Lehrer, for coming
Yes,
out
sir.
tonight. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Question for you was really in a subsequent debate, Candy Crowley took quite a bit of heat from some sides of different aisles about the fact-checking, quote-unquote, mid-debate. And if you could respond to your thoughts of the role of the moderator in terms of if you think there is room for the moderator if something is clearly misstated and asserted as truth, if there is room to do what Candy Crowley did, to clarify for the purposes of the audience, or if you feel like that's overstepping the bounds. I'd love to hear your response to that.
Well, we're running a little late tonight. As a general premise, I believe debate moderators are not there as fact checkers. They are there to facilitate the exchange between the candidates. If there's going to be any fact checking done, it should be done by the other person, the opposition, the opposing candidate. And that is difficult for people like me, professional journalists, to come to grips with, because it's the journalist's function to hop in there and say, hey, wait a minute. When you said that you were in Timbuktu when that happened, we have I know for a fact, or we have a story that says you were la. But if you think about, even think about the first, the debate I moderated in October. If I jumped in every time I wanted to clarify something, it would have stopped what the whole point of it was. And I take the view that those 4 90 minutes are or 3 90 minutes essentially for the presidential debates. Those three things those events are very, very important, but they're not the whole campaign, for God's sake. And the voter has to do a little work on his or her own as well. And you hear something, go back and check it yourself. The print media is there and does a lot, and the blogs now, everybody's fact-checking all the time. And you see the debate as a presentation and a confrontation, if you will, between the two candidates. And then all the stuff that flows from that can then be sorted out after that. And that requires a voter to be interested enough to go look at a newspaper, to go look at a link on a website or whatever, if you have a question about something. Because if the moderator interferes in the flow, I think that it interferes with the flow. And I think that's, in terms of priorities, the flow is more important than stepping in and saying, okay, and clarifying something or correcting something. I'm not criticizing Candy Crowley or anything else. I'm just saying that's my general view of it, and one thing I've always practiced myself. And it has not been easy for me to do that, because my instinct is the same as anybody else's who does this kind of work. But you have to put a different cloak on over your mind and your mouth and everything else when you moderate something. You are a moderator. You're not functioning in a journalistic capacity. You're functioning as somebody who's involved in a crucial event. And your job is to moderate a discussion and to moderate it, not to interview, not do simultaneous or back-to-back simultaneous one-on-one interviews with candidates, where some people go to these things thinking that's what they should do. It's not, to me, that's not what should be done.
Jim, let me ask you a question in terms of the presidential debates. I went down to the University of Mississippi in advance of the debate to see all the preparation. What's the schedule? What's the preparation time? What goes into putting on a presidential debate other than what we see when you come on the air with the candidates? But when I was taking the tour at Oxford and looking at the debate, there was an enormous amount of work and hundreds of people going on. What goes into putting on a presidential debate?
Well, it's a huge undertaking, and I only see a small part of it myself, Skip, because I drop in there at the last minute and do a couple of days ahead of time, and Oxford in particular was a difficult thing because remember the financial crisis happened and McCain said let's cancel the debate, and he wasn't sure he was going to come. There was a lot of byplay about what would happen if, because here again, the University of Mississippi had put in millions of dollars to sponsor it. In other words, to pay to have the debate, not pay the debate commission, but to pay the cost of the debate, the hall and all the stuff that went with it. And here they were going to be stuck with a bill and no debate. And there's a side story here. I was approached through intermediaries by the chancellor of the university saying, well, if McCain doesn't show up, we're going to have a bunch of students there. We're going to have 3,000 people in this hall and a bunch of students. Would you moderate a discussion between, because then Senator Obama had said, I'm coming no matter what. So the question to me was, would I moderate a kind of back and forth with the students and Senator Obama? And we could, and you know, fortunately, he hemmed and hawed and managed to avoid the answer in time. By the time McCain had said he would do it, but everybody who was connected with the debate, with the prospect of it being canceled, there were thousands of people involved, not just spectators, but people behind the scenes. There are all kinds of technical things. What they do, they rotate through the television networks as to who is the pool, not producer, but the technical producer. Now, there's an executive producer, a content person who oversees everything for the commission. But there are hundreds of people. Everything is because I have to remember all kinds of things, there's always the possibility of a technical glitch, so everything is, there are all kinds of backups to the backups to the backups. I did at Oxford. The thing is, the set back here, there was a hole in the set where there's a camera, where I'd be sitting here and I would look at the camera, look at the teleprompter to say good evening and all that sort of stuff. And they put a black piece of cloth over the camera so you wouldn't see the teleprompter when the opening shots came and the president and the candidates came in. And so then it was my time to say, you know, good evening. It's welcome to the front in Oxford, Mississippi. And all I saw was the black. Somebody had forgotten. His only job was to pull that black cloth up, and he forgot. And another experience with Gore, George W. Bush in St. Louis, town hall debate, doesn't matter about what kind of debate it was, but 3 minutes before air, we lost audio. I could not hear anybody in my ear, in other words, the producer, whatever. And I was very proud of what I did. They could hear me, but I couldn't hear them. And the floor manager, a real person, said to me, they've lost audio, and then he said in a very loud voice, so everybody could hear, so I could hear, he said, and we've got 3 minutes to air, and which I already knew. And I said, in my best, coolness, said, well, that's great. I said, just like that. But it's not necessary to take the full 3 minutes to get it fixed.
Pryor's got a question.
Yeah, right.
Senator Pryor's you got a question?
Jim, in your book, Attention City, you tell a wonderful little story. I think it was in New Haven. I'm not sure about it. Oh, yeah. Yeah. David's talking about an incident in New Haven. It was a Gore, Bill Clinton debate. And they had a holding room downstairs, and a makeup person came down, made me up, and I took off my coat for the makeup to get made up, and then there was this flight of stairs. It was a state. This was a theater, a legitimate type theater in New Haven. I mean, in Hartford. It was Hartford. And I grabbed my coat. They said, okay, come upstairs, 3 minutes to debate's going to begin. I walk up the stairs. Unfortunately, I had with me the guy who was then the executive producer of the NewsHour, who was kind of my handler. And he carried my coat, and I had taken off my credentials. You go goes over my head, and I had stuck them in my pocket. And so I will get up the stairs, and there's the stage, and I can see right there where this debate is going to happen. And this kid's Secret Service agent stops me. He says, "Where's your credential?" And I said, here again, I was fairly nice about it. I said, you know, actually, I am the moderator of this debate. And he said, "Where are your credentials?" And of course, my friend, the executive's desperately trying to get them out of my coat. I said, "Well, they're in my coat and whatever." And I said to this kid, agent, I said, "Look, there are only 3 people required to do this debate. And I'm one of them." And about that time, some older Secret Service agent came and grabbed this guy and said, "Come right this way, Mr. Lehrer." That was the end of it. And that's back to your, everything is, there's what they call in the Marine Corps, there's a Jesus factor to everything that's involved in all that. Everybody, if you're going to have security, it's going to be even tighter. If you're going to have food, there's going to be even more of it. If it's going to rain, it's going to rain more. Whatever, it's always there.
Ladies and gentlemen, we can now have copies of Attention City signed. Please welcome and thank Jim Lehrer for being with us.
Thank you very much.